Welcome, everyone. Welcome to week 3, Knowledge Unbound. Thanks for being on this journey with us. Knowledge Unbound is an interview podcast brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. We are generously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, and I'm joined here by my wonderful lifetime producer, Mr. Sega by my side.
It's so good to be back. I also noticed we have someone else in here. Is she the guest of this podcast? Is she the guest of this episode for this week? I surely wonder.
Because normally we record the intros and outros separate, and then we record the interview and we splice them together. But you know, Mekdi is hanging around. She's saying, "Oh, can I do the intro with you all?" So it's like, fine. So Mekdelawit, Masai, Deribe, our guest today. How are you?
I'm very happy to be here. I'm very well. How are you guys?
Very well. What are we going to talk about today?
Oh, a bunch. A little bit about me and my work, my dissertation work, a little bit about the Nile and Ethiopia, and a bit about what drives my work in general, a bit more personal.
And I think that last bit is, I'm excited for everything we discuss, but I'm really excited for listeners to hear about that last bit, because the way in which our guest today really embeds her sense of why in her journey, her choice of questions, the project she takes on. I truly hope it's an inspiration to you. We had a great time. Welcome to Knowledge Unbound. Can you give us the 3-sentence summary of what your work is, what you're interested in, and why it matters?
3 sentences. Okay. Mekdelawit is a researcher from Ethiopia working on the Nile River Basin.
Did you just refer to yourself in the third person?
Yeah.
Okay. Carry on.
And basically how I would describe myself is a passionate researcher working on the Nile who's also interested in education curriculum development, transdisciplinary education curriculum development, and social justice and advocacy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why the Nile? I mean, other than obviously Ethiopia has a big stake in it, right? But there's a lot of things you could have worked on in Ethiopia. Why the Nile? What led you to that point and that choice?
Sure. And the location has a lot to do with it because, and honestly, it's just things coming into alignment, my involvement in the Nile. So I originally did civil engineering out of sort of like necessity or lack of options. I had given the opportunities and options I had back home, when I had to choose university, engineering was the most appealing or the most interesting to me, given the situation.
So were there limited options?
In a way, yeah. I used to be very, very interested in political science, international relations, diplomacy, but I chose natural sciences in high school / preparatory school. So that option was sort of out of the question. And then even in natural sciences, I really wanted to go into physics. I liked astronomy and I wanted physics, but back then at least, you study physics and the trajectory or like the goal is you become a teacher, or that's how it was presented to me, which wasn't such an appealing future. So the next best thing was engineering.
What I liked against teachers.
I love teaching now, which is ironic, but that wasn't really a future that people wanted. Like, it doesn't pay well. There's no really, it's not appealing. And I was like this young, disciplined, studious person who's supposed to do this and that. So yeah, teaching wasn't really the goal, at least from my family side, from people around me. I felt that would be settling anyway. So that pushed me to engineering, and that was the closest thing for me to sort of do the things I loved. So I loved math, physics, STEM stuff. But once I got into engineering, and then I discovered the water world, right? So in engineering, I got to study water science, water engineering, hydraulic engineering, and those courses opened my eyes. And I sort of found a little bit of my interest area during my civil engineering, my bachelor's degree. So that showed me, okay, within civil engineering, I don't have to settle. There is something that I actually like studying, like doing. So the water path was I guess, started there. But when I was in second year...
If I could interrupt real quick, do you know why, say, of all the things that engineering opened your eyes to, why did water catch your eye, your interest in that particular
I don't know. It's just... I think I'll just chuck that up to interest.
Okay.
Engineering, it made me a critical thinker, like a methodological thinker, but water is just interesting. It's fascinating. And the other engineering stuff, so like the good thing about my bachelor education was it gave you an intro into literally everything. So we studied structural engineering, so buildings and roads and railways and water stuff and dams and all that stuff. And the rest of it was really dry for me. Water, no pun intended, but water was just interesting. There was something very exciting and appealing about it. But then when I was a second year student, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, one of the largest projects right now in the world, the biggest project in Africa, was launched, which was a game changer in my interest in water and further trajectory going ahead.
Right. I saw on your CV that you designed an airport.
That was my bachelor thesis. So
your bachelor's thesis.
Well, it was a group work. It was not just me. But
well, I know some people at LAX who might want to talk to you because they need some help. Anyway, I'm kind of reading between or maybe underneath the lines of what you're saying, right? Because your eyes were open to this interest in water. Okay, fine. It was just an interest, you say, but it just so happened that this major project, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, began around that time. It sounds like in that you're saying now water has come to represent something else with the beginning of that project. Can you talk us through a little bit how that coincidence of your interest and that project's beginning, what it activated in you and what it led to?
It's a nice way to frame it. So I'm a very demand-driven person.
Demand-driven, okay.
So if I can't see the value or relevance or demand for something, I can't be interested. When I was younger and in like prep school, elementary school, high school, I was just good at everything out of discipline. I did everything well because I wanted to, because I had to, not because I was particularly interested in it. Yeah. So that meant I was a very good student, but I really didn't know where my interests lie because I was good at everything. So this seeing the demand and the need became my bar for judging what's important, what's necessary, and what's worth my time. So there's that part of me. And then when it comes to Ethiopia, it's a very big country, almost 120 million people, a lot of people in poverty, still missing basic access to basic necessities, human rights like food, water, energy.
When you say a lot, do you know a percentage? Or?
Oh, yeah. Around half. So food security is still, it's better than it used to be, like, say, 20 years back, but still not 100%. Water security, access to water is still at around 50%. Energy access is around 50%, so 46, 47%. Sanitation, even worse, around 30%. Access to education has risen tremendously, but still not there. So, and all this, not because the country is like poor in resources per se, but because we couldn't capitalize on our resources. And one of the biggest resources is water. Ethiopia is called the water tower of East Africa or Africa, right? There is a quite substantial amount of water, around 122 billion cubic meters. But that water did literally nothing. It actually just became a source of conflict and wars for Ethiopia. And one of our biggest resources among this huge water resource in Ethiopia is the Nile. We call it Abai in Ethiopia, the Blue Nile. So the Nile has two major tributaries. The Blue Nile that originates from Ethiopia accounts for 86% of the Nile flow, and that's
what's the other major?
The White Nile. So that starts from Lake Victoria, the equatorial region. Those two rivers flow like meet in Sudan and then flow as the Nile proper.
Okay, and so that's Sudan only 14%.
Yeah. The hydrology is a little bit complicated. The part of the White Nile just sinks in the Sud wetlands in South Sudan. So a lot of water is quote unquote wasted or lost in the Sud. But yeah, for the sake of this conversation, 14%. Yeah. So the Blue Nile, that accounts for a significant portion of the water resources in the Nile for Ethiopia and also for the Nile. And there's this running discourse back home about how generally we don't use our resources, but we particularly do not use the Blue Nile, right? So there are songs talking angrily, sorrowfully about how the Nile doesn't have a home in Ethiopia and it just flows. It benefits others, as in like neighbors, but it actually loots its home. So I'm a kid that grew up listening to the songs, right? And so when this massive project, this hydropower project aimed at utilizing this particular resource and with the kind of impact it was supposed to have came online, it was like, whoa, like this is it. Like this is the demand. This is where the need is at. And luckily, that's where also I'm interested in. So it was like a match made in heaven, which is why I keep saying I got lucky in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
As far as like career trajectory was concerned, I really did get lucky. But it's things aligning in a certain way and my personality and things happening in Ethiopia sort of being streamlined that led me to the water field.
Would you say that the music you listened to and heard growing up that told those stories in that particular way, would you say that was your first awareness of the Blue Nile being something that was looted from, and that it was a sore spot for the country? And like, to what extent was there some of awareness through the music?
It's something I can't point to like a time frame when I became aware of it. It's like something that you just know growing up in Ethiopia. It's like everywhere, you hear it everywhere. So much so that it just you become numb to it. Thankfully, I wasn't, but it's just there. Like why weren't I guess my personality. Okay. There was when I was in elementary school. There used to be these really bad famines in Ethiopia, droughts and famines, because of the El Nino La Nina cycle that happened in the Pacific Ocean. But because, again, we don't use our resources well, drought translates into severe famines. And like every 7 years, 8 years, 10 years, there are these massive catastrophic droughts. And so 1977, 1988, 1990 something, like there are these massive droughts. And at some point, the Oxford English Dictionary had Ethiopia as an example for the word famine. And we used to hear that in elementary school. Like our teachers used to talk about that, and it used to unnerve me, used to make me so angry. Not because it was wrong, it is true.
Right.
But
well, what was the context when the teachers brought this up when you were in elementary? Were they bringing this up as a complaint, as how Ethiopia is depicted? Because, full disclosure, right? I mean, I grew up in the Caribbean, and, we did geography and we have some awareness of the world, but at least in terms of public images. So what you're saying is correct in that the images that you typically saw of Ethiopia was that was kind of the association, which even then I knew was really unfortunate. But so I'm wondering, when your teachers said this, was it a source of a sore point that this is how you're being talked about, or just a reality?
I mean, nobody could deny that it was the reality, but it just sucked to be like that poster child for famine. But the way my teachers were raising that to me was like, we can't afford to be lax. Your country needs you because of this. So that really stuck in me. It still angers me to this day when people refer to Ethiopia just in that context, especially given things have changed. But yeah, that, and then like the Nile being part of the reason why that happens, and all the external pressure that the country has to face because of this supposedly blessed resource. It's just a whole host of things came together. So when the GERD was launched, and the GERD is short for Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, it was just such a monumentally hopeful moment, right? Like the other day I saw my Facebook post from like 11 or 12 years ago. There's something I posted. Yeah. Something I posted when the GERD was launched, and the enthusiasm and the hopefulness, it was so nice seeing that. And it really was monumental. And not just for me, but for the entire country. This is a massive multi-billion-dollar project, which is not funded by any external funder organization. Every citizen gave from the little they had. We did not get any loans or any support. We made that happen. We are making it happen. So like the momentum of that time was just intoxicating.
Right.
And luckily for me, again, some of my teachers were the design team for the dam, negotiating team for the dam. So I felt like I had this firsthand information. I felt very close to the system, followed it very closely. And with my interest in water and then like all the master's degrees that I did afterwards, that opened my eyes.
Three of them. One of them could work with something. Right? Well, before I want to talk a little bit about, we will get into, the collective energy around the dam and that, because there's some really interesting things I want to unpack there. But I want to, for the benefit of the audience, just take a couple of steps back and give us a brief history as to why this water resource is underused, specifically around the Nile. Give us a little history of that situation.
Okay. So the Nile is a very complicated, a very political river. When you say the Nile, if you ask a random person on the road, what do you associate the Nile with, they would very likely say Egypt because of historic reasons. The Nile is historic, so it crosses 11 countries. So it starts like one of the tributaries starts from Ethiopia, the other from the Victoria Nile, but it flows to at the end of its journey to Egypt, and it has been responsible for like these massive civilizations in that region. So think Egyptian civilization, Sudanese Meroe civilization, our Aksumite civilization, and all the massive civilizations that came after that. Since that time, people have been in sort of low-key conflict about the water because the downstream countries, Egypt and Sudan, desert areas, highly, highly dependent on this water. But that water came out from outside of their borders. The Nile is a transboundary river, meaning it's a river that crosses political boundaries. So the hydrological limits of the river are not the limits of the water, so it spreads. That brings in politics. These days, international law, connection between people to the water. So historically, there has always been this effort to identify the source of the Nile and conquer it so that the water that goes down to Sudan and Egypt will never be compromised. This started during ancient times. So like ancient civilizations, Egyptian, Sudanese, and Ethiopian civilizations used the Nile as a bargaining tool. When Christians in Egypt were being abused, Ethiopian kings would say, hey, I'm going to dam this river unless you start treating those people right. So it was a sort of like a bargaining tool. And successive governments or protectorates, colonial powers that came in that region. So you can talk about the Ottoman Empire, Turkish Empire, who ruled Egypt for a while, really wanted to have that unified Ottoman Empire starting from the source of the Nile to the mouth of the Nile. So we had like 16 wars in the span of 50 years just because of this river between Ethiopia and Egypt. The British were responsible during the colonial time in the Nile Basin were responsible for a number of agreements, which the essence of all of them is that to ensure that countries in the upstream part of the river, so that includes Ethiopia, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, all these other countries around Lake Victoria, did not tamper with the water so much so that so the water flows uninterrupted to Sudan and Egypt. And this was fairly easy to do for them because they were in control of most of the countries in the basin, with the exception of Ethiopia, the only non-colonized country. But they also made agreements with other colonial powers, so they wouldn't use the water within their territories, this other colonial powers' territories. So think Italy, French, Belgium. So there has been this history of mistrust and very lopsided agreements, all to ensure that the water reached Sudan and Egypt, not even to favor Sudan and Egypt, but to favor outside actors, outside interests, colonial interests. So this has created a lot of tension between people in the basin, right? These are people across Ethiopia, Egypt, Sudan, all along the Nile. They're technically brothers. These are the one people, the same people. But because the Nile is a very political river, a very economically active river, geopolitically very active river, that it has seeded a lot of fear between countries, animosity, mistrust. Like I mentioned, it has been the cause of a lot of wars, implicitly or directly or implicitly, proxy wars. A lot of the instability in the Horn of Africa, particularly in Ethiopia, is attributed to that. And even in modern history, there's a documented history of external funders, Egypt blocking funds for water infrastructure projects on the Nile Basin in Ethiopia and other riparian countries. So you can imagine there isn't a lot of goodwill between these basin countries. And economically speaking, with the exception of Egypt, Nile Basin countries are fairly poor, and now it's become worse, but for the most part, it's politically unstable. So there was no way for these countries to be like a proper threat for the Egyptian hegemony on the Nile for the most part. So the fact that a poor country, which started growing rapidly for like 10 plus years, now wants to build a massive dam on the Nile, was a huge game changer, both in Ethiopia and abroad. So just summarizing that history, the GERD was a game changer because of the history in the basin, because of the inequality in the basin, because of the mistrust and all the subterfuge and proxy wars and direct wars.
And it sounds like everyone could typically count on Ethiopia not being able to pull off a good type project. Yeah. Therefore, you sort of lose every fight about that. So I know the last agreement, and I'm putting agreement in air quotes here, about it was, I believe, 1959 agreement. I know there's one currently trying to be ratified, but it hasn't yet fully. So just to bring us a little closer to modern times, can you tell us between 1959 and now, like what was that agreement in 1959, and what are you trying to, as a country, reverse now to make it fairer, if I can call it that?
So the precursor to the 1959, there was a prior agreement in 1929 where the UK and Egypt agreed to utilize the waters between Egypt and Sudan. So in 1929, Egypt was already a free country. It was free from the UK, but Sudan was still under UK rule. And for the most part in the history of the basin, irrigation was limited to Egypt, so there was really no need for an agreement as long as water reached in Egypt. But once Egypt was free, the UK wanted to expand their agricultural exploits to Sudan. So now they had to deal with Egypt so they could divert a little bit of water to their irrigation facilities, irrigation fields in Sudan. So in 1929, Egypt and the UK agreed that out of the Nile water, 48 billion cubic meters of water per year would still reach Egypt, but about 4 billion cubic meters of water would be diverted to irrigation fields. It's called the Gezira irrigation scheme in Sudan. That was the precursor to the 1959 agreement. In 1956, Sudan gets its independence. Egypt is already independent, and they see. So the annual flow of the Nile, for context, is around 84 billion cubic meters. The 1929 agreement only talked about 48 plus 4, 52 billion cubic meters. So they come together and say, hey, we're not utilizing this water fully, quote unquote, fully. So they come to the table and they draft this agreement called, quote unquote, for the full utilization of the Nile water. So because we didn't fully utilize this river between ourselves, let's draft up this agreement so we can utilize the entirety of the Nile water, which does not originate from these two countries, which crosses 9 countries before it reaches them and divided between the both of them. So essentially what the 1959 agreement does is divide the whole water. So at the time, 84 billion cubic meters of water between Sudan, Egypt, and evaporation loss, because these are desert countries. So out of the 84 billion cubic meters, 55.5 billion cubic meters goes to Egypt, 18.5 billion cubic meters of water goes to Sudan, 10 billion cubic meters of water is left for evaporation, which essentially leaves zero, nothing for these other upstream countries, which are the source countries, and by law, which have a fair share from the river. So that's the agreement that is signed by 2 countries. So it's a bilateral agreement. It's not even a basin-wide agreement. So that's the agreement that these 2 downstream countries insist is binding on all the other countries in the basin to this day. Obviously, this is a red line for Ethiopia, which was not party to the agreement. But also these other upstream riparian countries have also rejected it. Supposedly, the argument is that because they were under British rule, and if British signed the agreement, by proxy it applies to them. They obviously, if anybody knows about the Nyerere doctrine, they completely reject this premise and they don't ascribe to this principle. So in essence, Ethiopia and all the other upstream riparian countries, for all intents and purposes, this agreement does not exist for them. But the fact of the matter is the basis or the assumptions in this agreement have seeped into international law, have seeped into science, have seeped into scientific research, because those are the numbers that are being used in simulations, in scenarios, in scientific research.
Let me interrupt you there, because you may not know this, right? But I'm just wondering if, with scientific research, do you think that people who use these numbers are aware of the socio-historical context and how it might impact the accuracy of the numbers that are used?
Well, the seasoned professionals who have worked in the Nile for a while, I mean, if you're worth your salt for anything related to the Nile, you should know the context. And the seasoned professionals do know the context. But because there isn't an alternative set of baseline to use, they just default to that one, which is a big no-no for me. Like, let's work towards establishing a new baseline. Let's not reinforce this historical inequity. But that's what's happening. If you open the UN website that tells you about how much water resource every country has, you'll find the 55.5 billion cubic meters of water allocated for Egypt in the UN website. I know this is a podcast, I should talk, but that's it's just beyond imagination that such clearly unequitable, unfair agreement has seeped into literally the entire workings of policy, diplomacy, history, science in the basin, right? So this is essentially what the other upstream riparian countries are fighting against, and this new agreement that you mentioned earlier, it's called the Cooperative Framework Agreement. For the first time in our history, all 10 countries, well, Eritrea was an observer, so let's say all 11 countries came to the table, discussed equitably, and wanted to come to an agreement. And they spent 10 years. So this negotiation started in 1997. And they had a framework called the CFA, the Cooperative Framework Agreement, in 2010. And last minute, Egypt and Sudan did not want to sign it after negotiating on it for 13 years. So at the moment, for this framework to become into a law, it needs to be signed and ratified by 6 countries for it to be the law of the land. Right now, it's signed by 6, ratified by 4. So we still need 2 more countries to ratify it so it becomes the law of the land. But there's definitely no movement in that direction with regards to Egypt and Sudan. And some upstream countries have also not signed or ratified it. So, that's the state of events in the basin right now.
Okay, so thanks for that summary. Let's shift to GERD for a second, because it's an interesting, I've read a couple of articles in it, and one of the things that I have to confess, like when I first heard the name, right, the entire name, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, my first assumption is that it's done by the state government, right, by a large municipality or a central corporation. And, it's not. And I just want, I want you to walk us through just a little bit its origins, sort of who came together, how you decided this public funding structure, if I could call it that, and how is sort of that model is sustainable, right, moving forward, not just for the construction, but for the maintenance in the future.
Yeah. So I'll have to take you a little bit back into the history to get like an essence of the dam. Yeah. So we talked about the 1959 agreement, right? And our emperor at the time, Emperor Haile Selassie, actually sent a memo to Egypt and Sudan saying like, hey, we're not included in this agreement. It's not binding on us. Heads up. It's not like we can do anything about it. But then right after, he came together with the American government at the time, and he had this massive study done on the Blue Nile Basin by the USBR, United States Bureau of Reclamation. And so in 1964, they had this massive research outlining the potential in the Blue Nile River Basin. So 34 projects were identified. And one of the projects that was identified at that time was called the Border Dam, which ended up being GERD. That study has been in the hearts and minds of people since then. The ambition to utilize the Blue Nile, the Nile, has always been there in Ethiopia. This need to build a dam, right? So like I told you, ancient kings and queens used to threaten, saying like, "I'll dam this," not because they had the capacity, but because they knew the impact. Emperor Menelik wanted to build a dam on Lake Tana, which was the source of the Blue Nile. But it was during the time of Emperor Haile Selassie that a tangible move in this direction was done. But again, these are massive projects. We did not have the stability, capacity to do this on our own. And obviously, funder organizations were not going to fund this project because it would ruin relationships with Egypt. So that study was there, dormant for years. So when we talk about GERD, it's not a project that just popped out in the last 10 years. It's a generational dream.
Right.
So what we essentially did was like pull the study, brush it up, update it, and then build it, right?
Okay.
So
was there somebody who led that?
Well, it was mostly the initiative of the Prime Minister at the time, Prime Minister Mekdelawit. He was the one who, led the initiative, started the project. But again, this question of funding, where do we get the money, was always a shackle, right? And before that time, I don't think this project would have been possible, say, like 10 years before the time it actually got started, because we were not there. But the momentum that I told you about earlier, and this sense of resentment and regret at not using this resource, that was mobilized to publicly fund it, like you said. So when it was launched, it was supposed to be it was supposed to cost around $4 billion. And we said, we'll do it. We'll raise the money. And we did, somehow. We did. Fundraisers, lotteries, people were donating. We, even like as a young professional, gave our 1 month salary to the dam. Everybody was so very enthusiastic, still is to this day enthusiastic about the dam. We have fundraisers still going on. So this you can sense this generational, what's the word?
Angst.
Yeah, being capitalized for the better, like being harnessed effectively to fund this project. And as far as it being sustainable, we're at 92%, so I would say it's very sustainable. Okay. But once the dam starts, it has already started producing electricity. Part of the arrangement is that it's going to produce massive amounts of energy, around 5,000 megawatts. It's like double the capacity of the country right now.
Right.
And so part of that energy is going to be exported to neighboring countries, which is going to bring much needed foreign currency. So as long as the dam is done and complete, it's probably going to sustain itself. Like that's not a big issue. Getting it done was the big issue, and thank God it's almost there.
Yeah, yeah. So let's dig in a little bit more in this sort of public funding model, because it's, there's the economic complexity of it, right? Pulling it off and getting the buy-in and having that sort of collective sustained energy as you described. But in reading about the development of this, and not just the development, but the impact of this project on just the national psyche, it is very apparent to me that it's more than just that, right? It's more than just you sending a month of your salary to this thing. And I would say one essay that I know you wrote that for me really captures that whole sentiment is My Dam, My Why, My Dignity. And it's a really beautiful piece that we'll put on the website. And I encourage all of you to check it out. Tell us a little bit about that, how the building of the dam intersects with your sense of why, how it intersects with the not just your own sense of dignity, but the national sense of dignity, and how that has helped keep the mobilization efforts sustained and powerful.
I find the name of the dam, Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, very, very apt. Renaissance is the key here. Ethiopians are a very proud people, like too proud, I would say, to their own detriment, to our own detriment. But this sense of pride in themselves, in ourselves, and in our country does not really go with like the physical reality that you see. That dissonance, how we live this undignified life, like living like the medieval time without water, without lights, without education access, but still like having this really, really strong pride in your country. That dissonance is always very disruptive in the public psyche. So when you have this dam which promises to reignite Ethiopia, like reclaim your history, reclaim your future, be the renaissance for the country that you hope to see, it's so easy to see why that lands in every individual. And for me, I told you I'm a very demand-driven person, and then that felt like, okay, this is where I am needed, this is where I could be of help. And this idea of a dignified life is, my purpose is to be of service, so that everybody can have a dignified life. Right. So this it's just like seamless link, right? So this idea of a renaissance, this idea of reclaiming our past, our history, but also taking a hold of your future, like being in control of your future, making Ethiopia the great country that it was and that it can become. I think that's what garners people's passion for this dam. But beyond that, it's very symbolic because it also changes the status quo in the basin. Things have definitely shifted after the dam, like this implicit assumption that, the basin goes as Egypt wants. That's not the case anymore. Right. This dam has also given a sense of, yes, we can, not just for the Ethiopian people, but for countries around us, right?
It's an example, right?
Yeah. Right. It's like, permission seems a bit strong, but in essence, it is giving these other countries as well permission to do the same for their own people, right? And that changes things.
Right.
Now you have 9 countries essentially along the same line of thought versus 2 countries who are trying to cling to the past. That's going to change the status quo. That has changed the status quo. And that gives me hope because that means maybe there's a way forward towards some more equitable and sustainable use of the Nile in the basin. Right. Which happens to be the title of my PhD, but yeah.
That's all right. I'll let you repeat that. Maybe you're practicing for your defense or something. So, in the way you described it, right, it almost sounds as though as you actualize, right, into your scientific identity, into your science identity, its application to this demand, to use your own words, and to its opportunity to serve and be part of this renaissance. There was no other way. It seemed like there was no other way you were ever going to use your science.
I made my science work to the purpose I wanted to. Like I told you, was lucky in the sense that I could do anything. My grades were good. I given the opportunity my country could give, I could have chosen anything. It's just, this is just too good. So much better than anything that I could actually have chosen.
Could I ask you something on that? Because, I mean, I know you're saying this with respect to your own choices, right? And, not every engineering student, not every environmental studies student is going to come from Ethiopia or come from a country where you have these sort of major socio-political things to address. But we do have thousands and thousands of engineering students walking across stages getting diplomas. And I certainly hope that, podcast listeners, some of these podcast listeners are students who perhaps are inspired by your story and inspired that by thinking about science and their discipline and their life and their country in a particular way can lead them to choices. By your own admission, you had good grades. You could have done a whole bunch of things, and these opportunities presented themselves and they collided in ways that obviously have worked out. What advice would you give to students who might be, about to enter that ramp away from their undergrad degree, away from their master's degree, and thinking about how they can consider their own impact on the world, and perhaps don't have a good right now to run to, right? But they are inspired by you and they know they can help, and without really infantilizing the whole thing, but what message might you give them?
I would say, cliche, but finding your why. That helped me. That really helped me. There's this concept called ikigai, Japanese concept, that says your life's purpose, or like something worth living for. How you can find something worth living for, or your life's purpose, is when you find something you love, something you're good at, something you can actually get paid for, and something that's actually beneficial to the world. And it's at the intersection of these four things, according to this principle, that your life's purpose is. The GERD and the work I do, the PhD, the social advocacy, it's all in that intersection for me. So yes, I've been lucky, but I've also sort of charted that intersection for myself. I know my why. I know I want to be of service, in service of people. And I think understanding, or like at least trying to understand, and it's a long journey. It's a harrowing, it's an annoying, it's a frustrating journey to get to understand what your why is. But yeah, understanding your why, knowing why you're doing things, it helps. It helps. I don't think we're at the age where we can, and this is I'm not trying to, disrespect people who do like pure science or science for the sake of science. But I think we're beyond that time where we can just do science for the sake of science. I think science has to be people-oriented, problem-oriented, policy-oriented, right? Because we just don't have that luxury, I think. Not that we ever did, but we don't really have that luxury. I definitely know I don't I don't have that luxury. So I think putting people at the center of everything that we do, whether it be art, teaching, diplomacy, engineering, whatever, but putting people at the heart, and for me, it's trying to be of service to people, but understanding why you're doing the things you're doing and having that strong why will make everything you do afterwards sort of meaningful. Right. And it doesn't have to be the girth, but there will always be something within your lane, within your chair that you can do, which will be monumentally important for other people and incredibly satisfying and gratifying to your life as well. Right. And I think that's a good life. That's a life worth having. The struggles along the way, those will be worth it if you know what waits for you at the end of the journey, or even along the journey, right? I would say take time to understand what drives you, what keeps you going. Understand your why. Yeah. And there's a brilliant book by Simon Sinek that's called Start With Why, and a couple other videos that I know you shared with us. Which do make the case for why we need to start from why.
Right.
Yeah.
So let me take you back to that elementary class when your teacher was pointing out the association with farming and all of that stuff. And also, I think around that same age, you remember the music and what the music was saying about the dam and all of this, right? And fast forward to now, right, where you do have an opportunity to teach classrooms.
Yeah.
And even to bring back up the comment you just made about us not having the luxury of science not being people-centered. In what ways do your personal experiences, but also your belief that you just espoused, in what ways do they inform or impact how you approach your own classrooms, regardless of the subject matter?
Yeah. In essence, I don't do anything that I can't see having an impact out there. That's and there are things that I want to do that are extremely interesting to me, which just don't make sense on a large scale. Mm-hmm. And I have reached a point where I can't get myself to prioritize time for something not worthwhile. And that goes in teaching, that goes in all the projects I engage in, that goes for my PhD, that goes for the people I interact with. So when I teach, my aim is not to have my students cram in whatever topic I'm teaching. No, it's to get them to think, to learn how to think, so they can be able citizens who are ready to face the kind of problems that their world is going to face, that they are going to face in their world, which is going to be extremely more complicated than the world we even have now.
Right.
With my projects, at least in the short term, with the PhD, I ensure that there's a social element, a policy element, a diplomacy element, because I want my PhD to be applicable, which was a big issue in trying to get it passed, because the scientific novelty is what's really stressed in academia, and for good reason. But the applicability and the people-oriented, that's a good word, how you put it, it being people-oriented and being usable, that's very important to me. I don't think I can dedicate myself to anything that was not that anymore.
Right.
I hope that answers your question.
No, it answers it beautifully. And, and I bring it up because, these podcasts are going to be pre-recorded, right? So who knows what happens when it actually launches to the public. But I can't imagine it being that different from how it is now, in that we're living in a time in the U.S. context. It's tough sociopolitical times, tough political times when it comes to the relationship between formal education at the higher education level and civic behavior, right? And without going down the whole laundry list of how everybody feels about that, I know one of the struggles in STEM in particular is understanding how do I teach a class on Python, or how do I teach a intro chem class and bring in all of these values about being people-oriented, being committed to social justice, being committed to citizenry and good citizenship and all these kinds of things. And I'll confess to you, as somebody who does faculty development, I struggle a little bit, I think, trying to explain. And I think partly because we are so trained to need it boiled down to 10 things to do.
Yeah.
Without really sitting with a mindset of that's what it means to prepare somebody, right? So perhaps that debate for a different day, but unless you have a comment on it.
Well, it's a shame that you have to explain that to folks, especially in academia. But I agree with you. This is not, it's not something to do. It's something to be, right? And that takes time. It's agonizing. It's draining.
In a good way, though, right?
Well, because the output is going to be worth it, but it's not nice to sit in that space and try and work yourself to work something out. But it's worth it, especially if you believe in the power of education, and if you believe what you're doing in education is not teaching, but if it's making a generation, shaping a generation, a country. So, all the best. Good luck to you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. Let me shift gears a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about a study you did, which I found fascinating, about how the lyrics and the nature of music of certain genres shifted pre-GERD and during GERD.
Yeah.
And so to some extent, you can craft a narrative of how the society was, reacting psyche-wise before this construction began and when it was. And I'm kind of partial to it just because of somebody who's a music lover, who's, trained in music for a long time and, sees music as a place to tell stories and a place to understand how we navigate this complex world. And, particularly from the STEM world, a lot of time, even though a lot of STEM scientists are musicians, I don't know what percentage, but just as a discipline, right? This notion of griot storytelling as another means to narrate how these things develop. What led you to that? What made that interesting to you? What did you find from it? How has it, in any way, if at all, impacted how people have understood this development?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I'll preface this conversation by saying
history again?
I am not musical at all, but I am a music lover. And as I mentioned, the Ethiopian narrative, as far as music and art was concerned, was pretty in my face for me. Well, and for every Ethiopian per se. And that shift that you mentioned in narrative after the GERD was launched was very apparent. But it was an initiative by me and a good friend of mine called Mekdelawit, who's also doing her PhD now. And we were trying to present something for a conference, a hydro diplomacy conference. And I don't even know what sparked it, but we were talking about music. And then I was like, it's funny how the narrative shifted before and after GERD. And one thing led to another, critical minds, logical thinking. We were both doing our masters at the time. So that got us thinking, do you think this trend, this shift, was also apparent in Egypt and Sudan when they had their massive infrastructures there, when they had their GERDs per se? Because there's a big dam in Egypt called the Aswan High Dam, which was built in the 50s, around the time when the 1959 agreement was built, which literally transformed their country.
Right.
And there are a couple dams in Sudan, smaller dams, but with a different impact. So that got us thinking. The situation in Ethiopia and how the narrative shifted got us thinking whether this was also the case in other countries. And we started with Ethiopia, saw that shift, tried to look into Egypt and Sudan, looked into some music, saw like a slight pattern, and then dove into it. So it started out like as a slideshow presentation with like snippets of music lyrics. So we got a couple of our friends together, gathered the music, have them translate the Arabic into sensible English to capture the narratives. And surprisingly, there is sort of the same narrative, and that also highlighted how the Nile is not just universally loved, right? Like, so in Ethiopia, that dichotomous relationship of the Nile that I talked about, the love and adoration for this river, the beauty, it's considered the grace of the country. The word Abbai also means father, but it also means liar. So that dichotomy of
I don't know how I feel about that.
Well, it is a loot. It has been a loot. So that dichotomy was pretty apparent in the Ethiopian context. But we sort of thought like Sudan and Egypt is just like the Nile is just adored and loved. No, it's not the case. In Egypt, it is. Like, people are very attached to it. They call it father, brother. That's where people go to when they're sad, when they're happy. It also crosses their capital city. So it's like in the daily lives of people. Same thing in Sudan. But after the dam in Egypt, it was sort of like how it is in Ethiopia now. Like, yes, we did it. Colonizers, look what we did. That sense of pride in their own country, sort of like reclaiming the future. That was a similar sentiment. But we found out in Sudan, because the building of these dams displaced a lot of people from their ancestral homes. Okay. There was a lot of resentment and a lot of songs, very sad Nubian songs, that talked about how the voice of the Nile stopped for them, like how the river flowing stopped from them, how they feel disconnected because they're not living on their ancestral lands, which was really heartbreaking because these are not narratives that you hear out there. So it just became that little project became a very interesting thing, which we made into a video, which was very well received by people, opened a lot of doors, created a lot of networks, ended up being a book chapter. But it also lands easily with people because it's music. Like, it's easy to listen to. It's easy to get the concept.
Let me ask you about one more thing. You wrote an essay talking about the ways in which the GERD project helps women empowerment, general empowerment. But in that particular essay, you spoke specifically about women. And again, perhaps salient to the previous point, right? These things aren't just about damming water, right? They have all of these psychosocial externalities that impact, that have generative effects. Kind of focusing on that one particular thing, could you tell us a little bit about, what you've observed, what you've written about, what you hope for the future, what has happened, and in tangibly too, right? I know in general, I get the concept, right? But what have you seen in terms of have there been more jobs for women? Have you seen more women speaking up? I'm just picking examples here, but just giving a sense of what I'm asking.
So it wouldn't be fair to talk tangibly about the GERD as it concerns impact on women because it's not fully operational. Right now, I think 2 turbines are working, which means electricity, around 700 megawatts of electricity for the country, but that's about it. And it has only been like a year and a half since that happened. So in order to talk about a measured, tangible thing, that wouldn't be the fair time frame. But I tend to frame the GERD in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals because I want the GERD to have the eyes and ears of the international population.
Can you tell us a little bit about these Sustainable Development Goals?
Sure. The Sustainable Development Goals are these initiatives by the UN, the United Nations, and there are these 17 goals that supposedly the entire world is supposed to achieve by 2030, and they're very ambitious, lofty goals like zero poverty, zero hunger, complete
20 how much?
2030.
All right.
And
so we have
years.
7 years about
They're good goals. They're good goals to have. They are lofty, and I don't think we're going to get there, but it's still it's the aim for the stars kind of situation. So you have these 17 goals, like zero hunger, 100% access to food, water, energy, education, gender equity, climate change, a set of things. And my approach when it came to GERD, when it came to making GERD make sense for the international community, was framing it in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. But for some reason, people were particularly interested in GERD and what it would mean for women. And I understand that now. It just wasn't like a very dominant framing in me. So it was actually by request of people that I started thinking about that and trying to see, okay, would it really mean something more to women and girls in Ethiopia than the general population? And it turns out, yes, because right now women bear the brunt of the burden in the population as things stand now because of, history, social structure, all that, right? So by virtue of that, they're going to reap the most benefits from the GERD, right? So the benefits are universal. It's just that because they're overburdened now, the benefits are going to be extremely more important and relevant to them. Think access to electricity, which is the main goal of the GERD. But access to electricity doesn't stop at getting lights at your house. That means people getting more access to energy is going to mean people not traveling tens of kilometers to fetch water because there'll be pumps nearby to pump. That means not burning down your eyes with candles and kerosene lights trying to study. That means being able to access more education facilities. That means being able to access more healthcare facilities, because we have these clinics and hospitals like in rural areas. The building is there, but they're not functional because they don't have electricity. It means industries being able to work with 100% of their capacity instead of half as they are now, because blackouts are not going to be a thing. That means more job opportunities, which means more job opportunities for women as well. That's going to mean economic empowerment, which is going to impact gender equity. And it goes on like this. Climate change. Women also suffer from the brunt of issues related to climate change, not just in Ethiopia, but everywhere. So doing something, producing that much 5,000 megawatts of clean energy contributes to climate change, reduces deforestation. All that is going to have ripple effects that extend to all 17 SDG goals. But because women suffer more now, they're going to reap most of the benefits. And it's, the multiplier effect is great for everybody, and especially great for women. So, gender equity is still a big issue in Ethiopia. Access to education for women, access to healthcare for women. These are still important topics in Ethiopia. So I understand the focus there. So that's how the idea of GERD in relation to women came to be. And it's surprising to see. Part of being away from the context of Ethiopia, one of the lousy parts is you miss this. Like the gender issue is not like at the forefront of my mind because I was not in the Ethiopian context for a while. So people had to point that out to me, and that has been a very interesting lens to look at the GERD and all the developments happening in Ethiopia through the gender lens.
Okay. So I think people listening to this conversation might assume that you are already a diplomat or UN spokesperson, just given the depth of knowledge that you shared here. But you still have to finish your PhD, at least that's your plan. But without, I guess, getting too specific, because I imagine there are several options that might be appealing to you. What would you say is next for you after getting hooded? Where do you see you take all of this knowledge, all of these skills, and all of this desire and demand and make the biggest impact?
Thankfully, that has become more clear. But normally that kind of questions give me anxiety. But I have an answer for you right now.
I'm glad I'm glad I didn't do that.
So my interest used to be in academia, so the teaching aspect has always stayed constant. I love teaching, and I like to think I'm a good teacher. So teaching still at the core of what I want to do going forward. But in addition to teaching, through this work on the Nile, working at the intersection of science, policy, law, diplomacy, I sort of saw a gap in our education system. And I say ours as in like the Ethiopian education system, but I tend to think most other places would suffer from this too, in the sense that we are not training the next generation of citizens in a holistic way. We still have this very silo way of thinking, as if like problems are going to be solved by disciplinary solutions, which has never been true, but especially now. And the GERD and the situation in the GERD that has made that pretty apparent for me. So I'm very, very interested in transdisciplinary education curriculum in Ethiopia now. We actually did a pilot curriculum, and I'm very, very excited about that. Okay. So hopefully we can scale that up into a national initiative, start the work of preparing the next generation of people now, and then maybe in 20 years we'll have a good set of citizens who are able to handle whatever life throws at them, and then the country will be in good hands. So that's part of the goal or the trajectory going forward. And obviously, given the PhD, I sort of want to create a job post for myself as
that's
yeah, I mean, it's
I'm going to tell you
my job.
what I will do for you. Take some notes.
But essentially, I want to work as a science advisor in water diplomacy. I know there are a couple people who do that, but nobody I know has my credentials, my history, my opportunities, right? So I feel like I sort of have to do that. Like I'm very, very fit. Like because of my training, I'm an engineer. I have that technical mindset. I know what the engineers are talking about when they say, when they're spitting numbers or saying this and that. I can understand that because that is me. But through
because I cannot.
No, this is not to be braggy, but I am very lucky because through like my master's degree in the Netherlands, that it was supposed to be Masters of Science in Environmental, Masters of MSc, Masters of Science in Environmental Science, but that gave me a whole other view about the social aspects of water, governance. And through my work with the GERD and being very close to the negotiation, following it closely, trying to advocate for equitable and reasonable use, I sort of see that gap in diplomacy. So I feel like I have, two legs or all my legs in these 3 or 4 spheres. So I feel like I can work in the in-betweens. And there's a big language barrier among people working in this field. But the fact of the matter is, especially when it comes to transboundary water, it's not just science, or it's not just the law, or it's not just the diplomats. It's people from these 3 or 4 spheres coming together, sitting in a room and literally not knowing what the other person is saying because they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the context, right? I'm very lucky because I have that.
Right.
And so that just feels like a place that's waiting for me to fill. So science advisor, something in water diplomacy, definitely teaching, definitely education, curriculum development, because I think these are the things that are going to make lasting changes in the short term, the long term, definitely for Ethiopia, but can be scaled. Why not?
I am still hung up on you will create the job for you. I'm with you 100%. Like, I know you're not saying that like as a braggy thing. I get it. Like, right. And the sort of implicit message there is that some of the jobs of the future has to be defined by us, has to be defined by your why.
Yeah.
Whatever that job ends up being, Mekdi, I know you'll thrive and you'll bring a lot of change to the world. And I just hope you remember us whenever you get there.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I don't forget my friends.
You're listening to Knowledge Unbound. We had the pleasure of talking to Mekdelawit Masai Deribe. Mekdelawit, thanks for being with us today.
My pleasure. It was lovely talking to you.
You sure?
Yes.
Take care, everyone.
I'm standing, I'm on my journey.
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for Racially Just, Inclusive, Open STEM Education. Thanks today for the time we spent with Mekdelawit Masai Deribe. Mekdi, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for doing our opening and closing. That's a rare treat.
My pleasure too.
Our closing song today was written and performed by Jessica Kisunzu, chemistry professor at Colorado College. You can find her music on Bandcamp. She's pretty awesome. I trust you were as inspired as I was by the conversation. I trust you learned a lot about the ways in which social justice is a general concept that applies to anywhere we humans are, and we have to figure some stuff out. And I trust that you heard the tough choices that have to be made, and maybe in hearing those tough choices being articulated, it inspires you to make your own tough choices. That's all we could offer you. That's all we can offer you in any conversation. So until the next conversation, I beg of you, please be excellent to each other.
So this idea of a renaissance, this idea of reclaiming our past, our history, but also taking a hold of your future, like being in control of your future, making Ethiopia the great country that it was and that it can become. I think that's what garners people's passion for the STEM. For me, it's trying to be of service to people, but understanding why you're doing the things you're doing and having that strong why will will make everything you do afterwards sort of meaningful.
Right.
And it doesn't
Right.
have to be the girth, but there will always be something within your lane, within your chair that you can do, which will be monumentally important for other people and incredibly satisfying and gratifying to your life as well.
And though my body starts to shake and every step is hard to take, oh, I will go